Guys, boxing gossip here on a Tuesday evening. The observant of you will have noticed there's been very little activity in the last fortnight on my YouTube channel. I've been suffering with a bad case of the man flu, which is, let's say, 95% cleared up. So hopefully I'm going to be somewhat audible for any of you taking the time to tune into this video. I want to say thank you to everyone who's reached out to me to make sure I was still alive. A few people on Twitter, a few people on Facebook. I can't read my Facebook messages at present, so apologies to anyone who's messaged me on that. But, I'm back. I haven't been gone too long. We'll be back to do a podcast tomorrow night, Wednesday night, where we'll look at really the last 2 weeks worth of action and, go ahead to next week as well. But in my return video, I had a look at all the topics that I could discuss. The Ryan Burnett one, I was toying with, but I've decided to go with Chris Eubank Jr. versus Arthur Abraham, because as much as I don't want to, it's actually a fight that I quite liked. It's a fight actually that I believe, and I hope I'm not being overly arrogant in saying this, because I could be incorrect here, but I believe I was the very first person on YouTube or etc. to say that I thought this was the fight that was going to happen. I was actually doing a live stream when I received a tip-off from a source that this fight was very, very close to being made. And I sort of put it out there over the course of that video. Subsequently, there were some negotiations, as I understand it, with the likes of James DeGale. But, that fight didn't come into fruition. And, here we are. We're now looking at Eubank versus Arthur Abraham. Arthur Abraham is a guy who has been on the peripheries of world class for quite some time now. Obviously a champion at middleweight and a champion at super middleweight. A guy who competed in the Super 6 and a guy who's been in some very, very big fights and fought on some very big platforms. Most notably for UK fans, the likes of Carl Frotz, etc. Abraham is still a performer at a decent level. We have seen that when he gets in the ring with that Martin Murray type, that Paul Smith type, he still has enough to take care of business. We've also seen when he goes up against someone who represents world class, like Gilberto Ramírez, he is beatable. But I do believe that Arthur Abraham would be the biggest name on Chris Eubank Jr.'s win list if he were to be successful in the fight. And I do think it's a fight that matches up very well for Chris Eubank Jr. stylistically, and a fight that he could, do well in. It's a fight I expect him to win. Arthur Abraham, to describe him as a fighter, I would say a low volume fighter who tends to work in bursts. Most famously for the last 30 seconds of every round, but he's not someone who fights continuously for 3 minutes of a round. He's someone who very much fights in bursts, for 30 seconds, 60 seconds of activity where he'll look to put punches together. He is, I don't want to say basic, because I think basic is a negative word, but when I say basic, I mean his approach is quite route one. It's quite one-dimensional, which is a phrase I think Chris Eubank Jr. actually used in the press conference. But he walks in, he's got a high guard, he looks to take punches on his arms, he's got a very, very good chin. He doesn't do anything overly flashy, he doesn't do a huge amount of lateral movement, he's not massively slick. But when he puts his punches together, he's still a threat. He's not a massive puncher. He was known as a puncher at middleweight, but he's certainly not a massive puncher at super middleweight. But he's a hurtful puncher, and he can be an eye-catching puncher. For me, the key with Abraham is to establish effective aggression against him. If we look back to that first Paul Smith fight, when Paul Smith was able to really get his jab going in that fight, he was taking rounds off Abraham. Now, I know Paul Smith is a figure that British boxing fans love to hate, but even the most anti-Paul Smith guy would have to admit Paul Smith took 4 or 5 rounds off Abraham. Similar to Martin Murray, actually. I think I had Martin Murray 4-0 up after 4 rounds when he fought Arthur Abraham. The truth is, for me, when someone is able to be high volume against Abraham, when someone's able to get their work off, he kind of just goes into a bit of a defensive construct, and he doesn't tend to massively engage while he's under fire. That's what I've recognised against him. Now, guys like Paul Smith, guys like Martin Murray, they've got flaws to their game. But when Gilberto Ramírez fought him, who's obviously a guy who's got world-class movement, who's a bigger, rangier guy, a guy with a real solid jab and real solid work from range, Ramírez pretty much won every single round off Abraham just by keeping a consistent workload up from distance, which Abraham really, really struggled with. Now, Eubank Jr. is a guy who's all action. He's high energy. I don't believe that Eubank Jr. is anything like the fighter that Gilberto Ramírez is from range. I don't think Eubank Jr. is going to be best suited to trying to nick rounds from distance behind a jab with Arthur Abraham. I think Eubank Jr. is likely to pour it on Arthur Abraham here, because really, as we know with Eubank Jr., that's where he's most effective. When he's inside the pocket, when he's able to throw those uppercuts up the middle, when he's able to position an opponent with his backs to the ropes and throw combinations of hooks, head, body, body, head, etc. And I expect that's what Eubank Jr. will be looking to do. If we look at Eubank Jr. fights, there's a bit of a tendency to try and take rounds early behind a jab and to try and box, and then 3 or 4 or 5 rounds into the fight then start to unload his preferred arsenal of inside work. Having watched Arthur Abraham over the years, he's a guy who is also a slow starter. There's a real chance here that Eubank Jr. can maybe coast through the first 2 or 3 rounds before Abraham really looks to engage, and when he does, the fight could really turn into a bit of a barn burner, because Arthur Abraham has a proven world-class chin. He's going to be a very, very hard man to stop, even at this stage of his career. I believe he's 37, so we can say that he's certainly approaching the autumn of his career. But he's going to be a very, very hard man to stop. He's not going to be easy to get out of there. And, Chris Eubank Jr. is going to have to approach this fight as a 12-round fight. He's going to have to approach this fight with a mentality that it's a fight that could go to points, because Eubank Jr.'s power has been questioned extensively in the past. He was able to land some hellacious shots from Reynold Quinlan and other opponents without dropping them and without hurting them. And, against a guy like Arthur Abraham with that proven world-class chin, I think Eubank's got to be prepared for this fight to go 12. As for whether Arthur Abraham has what it takes to beat Eubank at this stage, I question that. I think the tactic of coming on strong for 30 seconds of barrage works well against guys like Paul Smith and Martin Murray, who are maybe lower volume, less athletic, smaller guys. But against Chris Eubank, who's so aggressive and so offensively minded, I don't think he's going to be the sort of guy who's just going to sit there on the back foot and let Arthur Abraham have his 30 seconds of success. I think he's going to be a moving target who's throwing back. I also think for Arthur Abraham, who is certainly fairly predictable in terms of the defensive construct that he creates, I also think he could be susceptible very much like Eubank uppercut. You can see Arthur Abraham putting his hands up like this. You can see Eubank Jr. throwing something up the middle and catching Abraham. I suspect that Eubank Jr. wins this fight with quite a bit in hand. I actually think it's relatively sensible matchmaking. I think Abraham's a big name. He's a guy very well known to the British boxing public and to the world boxing public. I think he is the highest caliber of opponent Eubank's been in with, other than Billy Joe Saunders. So I think it would be the biggest win of Eubank's career. And I think that Eubank is actually really stylistically well matched to a guy who's going to be low volume, to a guy who's going to let Eubank establish himself for large periods of the fight. Eubank's weakness for me is being outboxed by a slippery, slick, moving fighter like a Billy Joe Saunders. A southpaw who bobs and weaves and goes on the back foot. That's not what Arthur Abraham is. He's relatively static. He's relatively there to be hit. And he's relatively low volume. And I think I expect to see a substantial output and athletic advantage and possibly punch variety advantage from the younger man, Chris Eubank Jr. But it's a good fight. It's a fight that I'm looking forward to. Look, we can have a debate as to whether it's pay-per-view or not till the cows come home. The last fight wasn't a pay-per-view. It was a pay-per-view, but I think we were universally in agreement that Reynold Quinlan wasn't a pay-per-view caliber opponent. But the fight went ahead, reportedly did very, very bad numbers. but you know, they're back, and the Eubanks decided to go down the pay-per-view route yet again, so it clearly hasn't put them off. I do suspect that Eubanks' profile is growing. I do suspect that against an opponent like Arthur Abraham, there is a potential to sell more pay-per-views, because I think he's a bigger name and a more credible fighter. But you know, really, you can't say it's a pay-per-view fight, you know, at all. It's very much a fight at the end of Abraham's career. And obviously the only title on the line is the IBO title, which I'm sure all of us would agree should not be constituting a world title. Interesting that Abraham's actually taken the fight. You know, Abraham's always been a guy who's been a very big ticket seller. He stayed in Germany. He's filled out arenas in Germany. You know, and he's been a real success, at least commercially, in Germany. So interesting that he's coming over to take this fight. I wonder if after a few losses he's maybe, you know, finding it harder to fill out stadiums in Germany, or I just wonder if he wants to talent himself and test himself. But, you know, all in all, two well-known boxers, two guys who are on the fringes of world level, and yeah, a fight that could be a good stylistic clash. You know, when Abraham does have his 30 seconds bursts, it'll be very, very interesting to see how Eubank Jr. responds, and we could have periods of high action in the ring. Let me know your thoughts on this fight, people. You know, give me your comments, drop them in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Thanks for tuning in, guys.